What force moves a young man to abandon the comforts of the world to venture into the solitude of a cave? St. Francis of Paola, founder of the Order of the Minims, teaches us that true greatness is found in the deepest humility. His life, marked by austerity, penance, and an unbreakable love for God, continues to be a beacon of hope for devout Catholics seeking a path to holiness in a world that values the opposite: power, recognition, and material wealth. Today we will discover how a humble hermit came to be a counselor to kings and one of the most venerated saints of the Catholic Church. Chapter 1. Humble Origins. In the small town of Paola in the Calabria region of Italy, Francis was born on a cold day in March 1416. His parents, Giacomo Martolilla and Vienna de Fuscaldo, were peasant farmers of deep Catholic faith who had fervently prayed to St. Francis of Assisi to be granted the gift of a child. When their prayer was answered, they did not hesitate to baptize the little one with the name of the seraphic saint as a sign of gratitude and devotion. Francis's childhood passed in an atmosphere of simplicity and piety. From a very young age, his parents taught him the truths of the faith and instilled in him a deep love for God and the Blessed Virgin Mary. Little Francis absorbed these teachings as a fertile soil receives the seed, and he soon showed a natural inclination toward prayer and solitude. At the age of 12, Francis fell gravely ill with an eye condition that threatened to leave him blind. In the anguish of those moments, his parents renewed their supplications to St. Francis of Assisi, promising that if their son recovered, they would allow him to spend a year in the Franciscan convent of San Marcos Argentano. The miraculous healing came soon, and true to their promise, they sent young Francis to the convent. That year among the children of St. Francis was decisive for the future of the saint. There he learned not only letters and the rudiments of theology, but also absorbed the spirit of austerity and penance that characterized the lesser friars. Francis watched with admiration how those men had renounced the comforts of the world to follow more closely in the footsteps of the poor and crucified Christ. Upon returning home, Francis was no longer the same. A seed of vocation had been planted in his heart, and although he did not yet know clearly what his path would be, he was certain that God was calling him to a life of special consecration. His parents noticed the change in their son, and although it saddened them to think he might drift away from them, they understood that they had to respect divine designs. Chapter 2. The Call to the Hermitic Life. When Francis turned 14, he felt an inner impulse drawing him towards solitude. It was not a mere adolescent inclination, but a genuine divine vocation that burned in his chest like an uncontrollable fire. After much prayer and discernment, he told his parents of his decision to retire to a solitary cave in the mountains near Paola in order to devote himself completely to prayer and penance. The hearts of his parents trembled at such an announcement. How could they allow such a young boy to venture into the harshness of the hermitic life? However, recognizing the authenticity of the divine call and recalling their own promise to St. Francis of Assisi, they finally gave their consent with tears in their eyes, offering their only son as a pleasing sacrifice to God. The cave that Francis chose as his dwelling was located in a rugged setting, not far from the Tyrrhenian Sea. It was an inhospitable place, battered by winds in winter and scorched by the sun in summer. There, the young hermit built a small oratory with his own hands, using branches and stones, and dedicated it to St. Francis of Assisi, his celestial protector. Next to the oratory, he dug a small cell in the living rock that would serve as a refuge against the elements. Francis's life in that solitude was one of extreme austerity. His bed was nothing more than the hard rock covered with some dry branches. His food was reduced to wild herbs, roots, and the fresh water of a nearby spring. He wore a rough tunic, went barefoot, and imposed strict penances upon himself. But what might seem like an existence of unbearable privations for a young man his age was for him a true paradise. for there he could give himself entirely to a loving dialogue with God. Soon, the fame of the young hermit's sanctity began to spread in the surroundings. The inhabitants of the region came to him to request his prayers, ask for advice, or simply to witness the wonder of a life so holy at such an early age. Francis received them with humility and charity, spoke of God with simple yet penetrating words, and at times the Lord showed his pleasure in the holy hermit by granting graces and healings through his intercession. Chapter 3. Founding of the Order of the Minims. As the years passed, some young people, attracted by Francis's example, expressed their desire to share in his way of life. The saint, who had fled from the world in search of solitude, found himself becoming a teacher and guide of souls. After much prayer and discernment, he understood that it was God's will for him to found a new religious family within the Church. In 1435, at barely 19 years old, Francis welcomed his first disciples. With them, he built a small monastery next to his cave and a church dedicated to Our Lady of the Angels. Austerity was the norm of that nascent community. They slept on planks, fasted continuously, and dedicated long hours to prayer. Francis wanted his followers to practice a perpetual Lent, abstaining not only from meat, but also from eggs, dairy, and all animal-derived products. At first, that community had no rule other than the example of their founder and the Evangelical Council. However, as the number of disciples grew, it became necessary to draft constitutions. Francis, guided by the Holy Spirit, wrote a rule inspired by that of St. Francis of Assisi, but with a special emphasis on humility and penance. To underline the spirit of humility that should characterize his religious, he gave them the name Minims, that is, the smallest of all. The rule of the Minims was based on 4 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience, and a Lenten life. The latter was the distinctive feature of the order and consisted of a continuous fast from fatty foods, perpetually abstaining from meat, eggs, and dairy. For Francis, this bodily penance was not an end in itself, but a means to strengthen the spirit and master the passions. In 1470, Pope Paul II verbally approved the new order, and in 1474, Sixtus IV granted official approval through the bull Sedes Apostolica. The small seed planted in the cave of Paola had grown into a flourishing tree whose branches spread throughout Italy. The Minims distinguished themselves by their austere lifestyle, their love for solitude and prayer, and their dedication to charitable works, especially among the poorest and abandoned. Chapter 4. The Miracles of Francis. The life of St. Francis of Paola was marked by prodigies that manifested divine favor for this humble servant. However, the saint never attributed these miracles to his own merits, but always recognized himself as a mere instrument in the hands of God. His motto, Caritas, charity, was the driving force behind all his actions, and it was precisely this overflowing love for God and neighbor that attracted heavenly blessings upon him. One of the best-known miracles occurred when Francis wished to cross the Strait of Messina to travel to Sicily. Not having money to pay for passage on a boat, he went to the shore with filial confidence in divine providence. There he spread his cloak over the water, made the sign of the cross, and to the astonishment of those present, he crossed the strait by sailing on his cloak as if it were a raft. This miracle recalls the parting of the Red Sea by Moses and shows how God upholds those who trust in him completely. On another occasion, during the construction of the Paterno monastery, a huge boulder threatened to crush the workers. Moved by charity toward his brothers in danger, Francis approached the rock and, making the sign of the cross, stopped its fall and shifted it with his own hands as if it were a feather. The witnesses were amazed at such a prodigy, but the saint reminded them that it was not his strength, but that of God, that had performed the miracle. The gift of prophecy also adorned the holy hermit. On numerous occasions, he predicted future events with astonishing accuracy. He announced public calamities to move people to conversion, warned sinners of the imminence of their death so that they might reconcile with God, and foretold the future with such precision that many sought him out before making important decisions. But perhaps his greatest miracle was the spiritual transformation he effected in those who came near him. Hardened men in vice left his presence converted and willing to change their lives. Marriages on the brink of breakdown regained harmony after hearing his counsel. Irreconcilable enemies embraced with tears in their eyes after an intervention by the saint. The power of his word, combined with the holiness of his life, penetrated even the hardest hearts and opened them to the action of grace. What does the life of Saint Francis of Paola inspire in you? Had you known his story, or is this the first time you discover his testimony? Share your experience in the comments. Chapter 5. Exemplary austerity. The life of Saint Francis of Paola was a continuous exercise in mortification and penance. From his youth, he embraced an austerity so extreme that it was astonishing even by the monastic standards of his time. This austerity did not arise from a disdain for creation, but from a burning desire to imitate the crucified Christ and to atone for the sins of the world. The saint slept only a few hours on the hard ground or on a plank, using a log or a stone as a pillow. Often he spent most of the night in prayer, kneeling on the cold floor of his cell or church. His disciples frequently found him in ecstasy, his face transfigured by divine conversation and sometimes lifted from the ground, as if his soul, in its longing to unite with God, also dragged his body toward the heights. His diet was extremely frugal. For most of his life, he fed exclusively on wild herbs, roots, and dried fruits. He fasted rigorously during Lent, taking in barely enough to sustain life. In his later years, he allowed his religious a somewhat less severe diet, but he continued his austere habits until the end of his days. Francis's clothing was equally simple, a rough, undyed wool tunic, belted at the waist with a rope, and he always went barefoot, even in the rigors of the Calabrian winter. He rejected any garment that could be considered a luxury or an indulgence to vanity. His external appearance faithfully reflected his inner spirit, stripped of all superfluous things and focused solely on God. But Francis's austerity was not an end in itself, but a means to attain freedom of the spirit. By mastering his passions and appetites through mortification, he achieved an inner serenity and a peace that radiated to those around him. His face, despite the penances, did not show the sorrow of a gloomy ascetic, but the serene joy of one who had found the true treasure. As he used to say, "It is not penance that saddens, but sin. He who has renounced sin for the love of Christ finds in the cross the sweetest consolation." Chapter 6. The Counselor of Kings. The sanctity of Francis spread beyond borders and reached royal palaces. In 1483, King Louis XV of France, fearing the imminence of death and tormented by remorse for his sins, summoned the holy hermit. The monarch, who had heard of Francis's miracles, hoped that he would grant him a miraculous healing to prolong his days. Pope Sixtus IV, at the king's request, ordered Francis to come to France. The humble hermit, though he preferred the solitude of his cave, promptly obeyed the papal directive, recognizing in it the will of God. He embarked on the long journey accompanied by some of his religious, crossing Italy and being received with honors as he passed through the cities. Upon arriving at the castle of Plessis-les-Tours, where the monarch resided, Francis was received with great pomp. The king, however, was puzzled to see that the man from whom he expected a spectacular miracle was a humble old man dressed in a worn tunic and barefoot. Nonetheless, he received him with respect and expressed his petition. He wanted to be healed so he could continue to reign. Francis, with the freedom that characterizes saints, was not impressed by royal majesty. With simple but direct words, he spoke to the king not of the healing of the body, but of the soul. He exhorted him to prepare for death, which was approaching inexorably, and to reconcile with God through sincere confession. He spoke of the vanity of earthly honors in the face of the eternity that awaited him, and urged him to redress the injustices committed during his reign. The word of the saint, inspired by the Spirit, touched the heart of the monarch. Louis XV, who had been feared for his cruelty and cunning, suddenly found himself disarmed before the moral authority of that humble friar. In the following days, the king confessed, returned ill-gotten gains, released unjustly imprisoned prisoners, and prepared for death with Christian serenity. When he died shortly thereafter, he did so reconciled with God, thanks to the providential intervention of Francis. Chapter 7. Devotion to the Virgin Mary. Among the virtues that adorned the soul of St. Francis of Paola, his tender devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary stood out. From his childhood, he had learned from his parents to love and venerate the Mother of God. And this filial love grew and matured throughout his life until it became one of the most characteristic traits of his spirituality. The first church that Francis built next to his hermitic cave was dedicated to Our Lady of the Angels, thus manifesting his desire to place all his work under Mary's maternal protection. In the main altar, he placed an image of the Virgin, before which he spent long hours in prayer, entrusting to her all his worries and asking for her intercession for the proper development of the nascent religious order. Francis instilled in his religious the same Marian devotion. In the Rule of the Minims, he established that on all Saturdays and during vigils of the Virgin's feasts, a special fast should be observed as an act of love toward the Mother of God. He also instituted that in all the churches of the order, the Holy Rosary be prayed daily in community, to contemplate with Mary the mysteries of her Son's life. In his sermons, the holy hermit frequently spoke of the Virgin Mary, presenting her as the perfect model of all virtues and as a sure way to Christ. He who loves Mary, he used to say, learns to love Jesus as he wishes to be loved. He strongly recommended the recitation of the Hail Mary, teaching that this simple prayer, repeated with faith and love, had the power to ward off temptations and attract the blessings of heaven. One of the special graces that Francis received for his Marian devotion was the frequent apparitions of the Blessed Virgin. His biographers relate that at crucial moments in his life, Mary appeared to him to console, strengthen, or instruct him. On one occasion, while he was in prayer, he saw the Virgin surrounded by angels who gave him a scapular as a sign of her protection. This scapular would later become part of the habit of the Minims, a visible reminder of Mary's maternal protection over the order. Chapter 8. The Charisma of Charity. Charity, the theological virtue that unites us to God and to our neighbor through love, was the central axis of St. Francis of Paola's life and spirituality. It was no accident that he chose the word caritas as the motto of his order, intending to indicate that the love for God and neighbor should be the distinguishing mark of his religious in the midst of the church and the world. Francis conceived of charity not as a fleeting feeling or an external activity, but as a vital attitude that should permeate every thought, every word, and every action. For him, true charity began in the heart, in that inner disposition that makes us see in every human being a brother for whom Christ shed his blood. This supernatural vision allowed him to treat both the noble and the beggar, the wise and the ignorant, with the same respect and kindness. One of the most visible manifestations of the saint's charity was his concern for the poor and the sick. In every Minim monastery, he established a guest house and a dispensary where those in need were welcomed, provided with food, and had their ailments treated. Francis himself personally attended to the gravely ill, washing their wounds and comforting them with words of Christian hope. In times of epidemics or famines, the order's monasteries became true centers of social assistance, where no one was turned away. Francis's charity also extended to the spiritual realm. He devoted long hours to listening to those who came to him seeking comfort or advice. With inexhaustible patience, he attended to both profound problems and everyday worries. His gift of discernment allowed him to get to the heart of situations and offer the right word that enlightened and strengthened. Many testimonies from that time speak of people who arrived at his presence overwhelmed by seemingly insurmountable problems and left with an inner peace that could only be the result of the action of the Holy Spirit through the saint. Perhaps where Francis's charity shone most brilliantly was in his treatment of sinners. Far from adopting a condemning attitude, he welcomed those who had strayed from God with a mixture of firmness and tenderness that disarmed even the most stubborn resistances. He did not disguise the gravity of sin, but he knew how to simultaneously show the infinite mercy of God, ever ready to forgive the one who sincerely repents. Thanks to this balance between truth and love, he achieved countless conversions, some of them truly spectacular, as they involved people who had been far from the faith for years. Chapter 9. The Last Years in France. After fulfilling his mission with King Louis XV, Francis intended to return to Italy. However, the successors of Louis, first Charles VIII and then Louis XV, insisted that he remain in France. Recognizing in this request the divine will, the saint agreed to establish himself permanently in the Gallic country, although his heart continued to long for the Calabrian mountains where his hermitic life had begun. The monastery of Plessis-les-Tours thus became Francis's permanent residence during the last 25 years of his life. There, he continued his usual routine of prayer, penance, and charitable works, attracting multitudes who came seeking advice, comfort, or healing. The humble cell of the hermit became a pilgrimage site for people from all social backgrounds, from nobles to peasants, all equally eager for the word and blessing of the saint. Despite his advanced age and the ailments typical of a life of austerity, Francis remained ceaselessly active. He continued personally directing the construction of new monasteries, visiting the sick, preaching frequently, and attending to correspondence that arrived from all over Europe. His fame for sanctity was such that even monarchs from other countries like Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain wrote to him requesting his prayers and advice. During this period, Francis devoted special attention to consolidating his order. He drafted a definitive version of the rule, which was approved by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, and composed a liturgical ceremonial to unify worship practices in all the monasteries. He also established a second order for women and a third order for lay people, thereby extending the charisma of the Minims beyond the cloisters to families and society. Despite living in a foreign country, Francis never lost contact with his native Italy. Through copious correspondence, he continued to guide the monasteries he had founded there, and regularly sent religious trained in France to keep alive the original spirit of the order. In addition, he received with special affection the Italian pilgrims who arrived at Plessis-les-Tours, with whom he conversed in his Calabrian dialect, nostalgically recalling the landscapes of his homeland. Chapter 10. The Death of the Saint. With the arrival of the year 1507, Francis, who was already 91 years old, felt that the moment of his departure to the Father's house was near. His body, worn out by penances and apostolic labors, began to fail, but his spirit remained vigorous and lucid. With the serenity typical of one who has lived preparing for that moment, he began to arrange everything necessary for his passage. On the Feast of the Annunciation, March 25th, Francis celebrated Holy Mass with extraordinary fervor. Those who attended noticed an unusual radiance on his face, as if he already glimpsed the glory that awaited him. After the celebration, he gathered all the religious of the community and gave them his final recommendations. He urged them to persevere in observing the rule, especially with regard to fraternal charity and the austerity of life, and asked them to always keep alive the spirit of humility he had sought to instill in the order. During Holy Week, despite his extreme weakness, Francis wished to participate in all the liturgical offices. On Maundy Thursday, he personally washed the feet of 13 poor people, following the example of Christ. And on Good Friday, he joined with special intensity in the Passion of the Lord. His physical deterioration was evident, but his face reflected a peace and joy that surprised those around him. On Easter Sunday, April 2nd, 1507, after receiving the Holy Sacraments with extraordinary devotion, Francis asked to be left alone to prepare for the final encounter with his Lord. When hours later the religious entered his cell, they found him on his knees, his hands joined in prayer and his eyes fixed on a crucifix. He had surrendered his soul to God with the same simplicity and humility with which he had lived. The news of the saint's death quickly spread throughout France. An immense crowd came to Plessis-les-Tours to venerate his mortal remains, which were displayed for a week. According to testimonies of the time, Francis's body showed no signs of decay and emitted a soft fragrance. Numerous miracles began to occur through his intercession, confirming the sanctity of the one who in life had been known as the Thaumaturge of Calabria. Chapter 11. The relationship with nature and the care of creation. Saint Francis of Paola, like his namesake from Assisi, manifested throughout his life an extraordinary connection with nature, recognizing it as God's creation and treating it with reverence and love. This special relationship with creation is one of the lesser known but most inspiring aspects of his spirituality, and it deserves to be highlighted as a fundamental part of his legacy. From his early years as a hermit in the mountains of Calabria, Francis developed a profound communion with the natural surroundings. His cave, situated in a rugged and lonely spot, became a sanctuary where the saint contemplated the beauty of creation and lifted his soul to God through it. Biographers relate how he spent hours watching the flight of birds, the flow of waters, or the growth of plants, discovering in every creature a reflection of divine wisdom and goodness. This contemplation of nature was not a mere aesthetic exercise for Francis, but an authentic, mystical experience. Through creatures, he ascended toward the Creator in a movement reminiscent of Jacob's ladder, from the visible to the invisible, from the contingent to the eternal. In every wildflower, he told his disciples, we can read a message from God. In the tree that spreads its branches, we learn about divine generosity. In the water that descends from the mountain, we contemplate the grace that constantly flows toward us. The relationship Francis had with animals is one of the most moving chapters of his biography. Numerous testimonies speak of his ability to communicate with them and the docility with which they responded to his call. One day, while praying in the forest, a deer pursued by hunters sought refuge by his side. Francis welcomed it tenderly and protected it, forbidding the hunters from killing it. On another occasion, a wolf that had been frightening the local inhabitants became tame under the saint's gaze and began to live peacefully with the people. These episodes, reminiscent of the famous accounts about Saint Francis of Assisi, show how true sanctity restores the original harmony between humankind and the rest of creation. But perhaps the most notable aspect of Francis's relationship with nature was his sobriety in the use of natural resources. At a time when the excessive exploitation of the land was beginning to manifest in some regions of Europe, the saint practiced and taught a lifestyle based on austerity and respect for the environment. The Minims monasteries were characterized by their simple architecture, harmoniously integrated into the landscape, and by their gardens, cultivated according to methods that we would now call ecological. Francis insisted that his religious take only what was necessary from nature, avoiding any form of waste or unnecessary accumulation. Chapter 12. The Spiritual Legacy. The physical death of Saint Francis of Paola did not signify the end of his presence in the church and in the world. On the contrary, his spiritual influence intensified and spread after his passage to heaven. Pope Leo X, recognizing the extraordinary sanctity of his life and the numerous miracles that occurred through his intercession, canonized him on May 1st, 1519, just 12 years after his death. A remarkably rapid process for the time. The Order of the Minims, the main institutional legacy of the saint, continued to grow and expand throughout Europe and America. At the time of the canonization of its founder, it already had more than 450 monasteries spread across several countries. The Minims distinguished themselves by their fidelity to the original charisma, a life of austerity, prayer, and charity, always at the service of the most needy. Over the centuries, the order has given the Church numerous saints, blesseds, and venerables, all continuing the spirit of humility and charity of their founding father. The spirituality of Saint Francis of Paola has left an indelible mark on the ascetic tradition of the Catholic Church. His emphasis on the Lenten life as a path of purification and his insistence on charity as the central virtue of Christian life have inspired generations of the faithful. The famous maxim of the saint, "Charity is the fulfillment of the law," perfectly summarizes his teaching and continues to be a beacon for those seeking evangelical perfection. Popular devotion to Saint Francis of Paola spread quickly throughout Europe, especially in Italy, France, and Spain. He is invoked as the patron of sailors for his miraculous crossing over the waters of the Strait of Messina, of the barren who wish for offspring in remembrance of his own birth following his parents' prayers to St. Francis of Assisi, and of penitents because of the exemplary austerity of his life. Countless churches, chapels, and oratories have been dedicated to his memory over the centuries. But perhaps the most significant aspect of St. Francis of Paola's legacy is his testimony that true Christian greatness lies in making oneself small for the love of Christ. In an era characterized by the desire for power and recognition, the Calabrian hermit reminds us that the path to God passes through humility, austerity, and selfless service to others. This message, far from losing its relevance, takes on special significance in our contemporary world, where individualism and consumerism threaten to drown the evangelical values of poverty and charity. Chapter 13. Lessons for Everyday Life. The life of St. Francis of Paola stands as a beacon of light amid the whirlwind of today's world. His existence, marked by austerity, prayer, and total dedication to others, offers us a concrete example of how spirituality can be integrated into every aspect of daily life. In a context where materialism and an excess of stimuli dominate our environment, his testimony invites us to pause, reflect, and rediscover the path to true inner peace. The first great lesson the saint offers is the value of humility. His constant renunciation of vanities and superfluous things teaches us that true greatness is not measured by possessions or social recognition, but by the ability to love and serve without expecting anything in return. This attitude of modesty and simplicity translates into the practice of valuing every small act of kindness and in the search for a lifestyle that favors the well-being of the soul over material comfort. Likewise, the hermitic life of Saint Francis of Paola reminds us of the importance of cultivating moments of reflection and silence in our daily routine. The regular practice of prayer, meditation, and inner retreat becomes an essential tool to counteract the constant noise and anxiety generated by modern demands. By imitating his discipline, we can learn to momentarily disconnect from external agitation to reconnect with our inner being and the divine, opening the door to greater clarity and serenity in our daily decisions. Another crucial aspect is his unwavering commitment to charity and service to others. St. Francis of Paola shows us that every act of help, no matter how small, has the power to transform lives. His example inspires us to lend a hand to those in need and to foster relationships based on selfless love and empathy. In a society where individualism and competitiveness often prevail, his legacy reminds us that true success lies in solidarity and genuine care for our fellow human beings. Finally, his life challenges us to rethink our own habits and priorities. Embracing simplicity, humility, and dedication to others involves a daily commitment to personal transformation. By internalizing these teachings, we can build a fuller and more meaningful life, where the pursuit of spiritual well-being and community service become fundamental pillars for facing contemporary challenges with faith and hope. Chapter 14. Parallels with Saint Francis of Assisi and other models of holiness. The figure of Saint Francis of Paola resonates deeply with the legacy of Saint Francis of Assisi, and both saints share a path marked by renunciation of the material and total dedication to the spiritual life. While Saint Francis of Assisi is widely remembered for his love for nature and his fraternity towards all creatures, Saint Francis of Paola follows a similar path by embracing the hermitic life and austerity, demonstrating that true holiness is expressed in simplicity and humble service. In both cases, the connection with creation is fundamental. Saint Francis of Assisi was known for his ability to see in every tree, animal, and landscape the manifestation of divine love, teaching that nature is a reflection of God's work. Similarly, Saint Francis of Paola found in the solitude of nature the perfect setting for contemplation and prayer. This deep bond with the environment not only allowed both saints to experience the presence of God directly, but also prompted them to promote a life of respect and care for creation, inviting us to reflect on the importance of sustainability and environmental responsibility in our day. Beyond the connection with nature, both saints share the conviction that true freedom and fulfillment are achieved through simplicity and the renunciation of excesses. Saint Francis of Assisi opted for a life of voluntary poverty, renouncing wealth to live in communion with the Creator and his brothers. In a similar way, Saint Francis of Paola practiced an austerity that went beyond mere material abstinence, integrating into his daily life discipline, penance, and service to others as means to attain spiritual perfection. This similarity in ideals invites us to question the priorities of our contemporary society, where success is measured by accumulation and ostentation, and challenges us to seek a more authentic and committed way of life in favor of the common good. Moreover, these parallels highlight the idea that holiness is not an unattainable state reserved for a few, but a path accessible to all who decide to live according to deep and transformative values. Both Saint Francis of Assisi and Saint Francis of Paola teach us that every act of humility, every moment of prayer, and every gesture of charity contributes to building a more just and humane world. Their example transcends the barriers of time and stands as a model of inspiration for current generations, inviting us to adopt an attitude of service and compassion that ultimately brings us closer to the essence of divine love. Finally, the union of these legacies offers us an integrated vision of holiness, one that encompasses both the inner and outer dimensions. The practice of faith, respect for creation, and commitment to others interconnect on a unique path towards spiritual fulfillment. In reflecting on the life and teachings of these saints, we are called to reinvent our own existence, to transform our daily actions, and to find in simplicity and solidarity the key to a life full of meaning and hope. Chapter 15. Prayer to Saint Francis of Paola. O glorious Saint Francis of Paola, humble hermit and faithful servant of God, who from your youth embraced the cross of Christ with admirable constancy and distinguished yourself by your spirit of penance and charity, hear our supplications on this day. You who chose humility as the path to God and wish that your followers be known as the Minims, the smallest in the kingdom of heaven, teach us to recognize our nothingness before the divine majesty and to seek true greatness in selfless service to our brothers. You who practiced an astonishing austerity, feeding on wild herbs and sleeping on the hard ground, help us to free ourselves from the bondage of material possessions and to find true freedom in evangelical detachment. You who made charity the motto of your life and the distinguishing mark of your order, inflame our hearts with that same love for God and neighbor, that following your example, we may learn to see in every brother, especially in the poorest and most abandoned, the face of the suffering Christ. You, who were favored by God with the gift of miracles and healed so many of both body and soul, direct a look of compassion toward our needs and afflictions. Obtain for us from the Lord physical health, if it is fitting for our salvation, and above all, the spiritual health that will lead us to eternal life. You, who with simplicity and firmness guided kings and powerful men toward the path of salvation, help us to bear witness to our faith without fear or respect for human opinions, even in the most hostile or indifferent environments to the evangelical message. Finally, O beloved Saint Francis, you who now enjoy the beatific vision in the company of the Blessed Virgin, whom you loved so dearly in life, be our intercessor and advocate before the throne of divine mercy. Through your intercession, may we obtain the grace to persevere in the faith until the last moment of our lives and be worthy to share with you in the glory of the blessed in heaven. Amen.